Hey everybody, welcome to the BetUS NFL show. I'm your host, Matt Landis, joined by expert football handicappers LasVegasCris on your left and Scott Kellen on your right if you're watching us on YouTube. Today, we keep the division previews rolling. It's a focus on the NFC North. But guys, before we dig in, we've gotten some quarterback news this week. Sounds like Denver's going the safer route with Teddy Bridgewater and the Saints shooting for some upside with Jameis Winston.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting, Matt. Like you said, the Saints have gone with the upside, maybe more mistakes with Winston, of course, but clearly much more upside. These two teams are very interesting because both quarterbacks kind of represent similar things. And then, of course, Bridgewater, like you said, it's a safer side where Drew Lock, would have been more of the upside potential, but also coming with, potentially plenty of mistakes as well. The other thing that I thought was interesting, and you guys tell me if I'm mistaken on this, it seemed like that line for Denver in week 1 against the Giants was -1. And as soon as they announced Bridgewater, that went to 2.5. Clearly, the market's saying they like that move, at least from a betting perspective, and probably just speaking to the consistency and the stability that you're getting out of Bridgewater, even though it may lack some of the upside potential.
Yeah, I agree with you. I noticed that line move myself yesterday, and I saw it tick up to 2, and then today I noticed 2.5 popping up. I'm kind of surprised about that. Frankly, I thought the Giants would get more love, and game day, I think we might see that line come down regardless, because I don't think the betting public's going to respect Denver on the road laying points. But I think they made the right move with Bridgewater. I expected I didn't expect Bridgewater, but I was kind of in the back of my head saying, maybe they should go with the safer guy that's not going to make any excuses or make mistakes and such like that. And then as far as the Saints, I had fully expected them to go to Winston. That's no surprise. But what bothers me is seeing something today that, and I only saw one blip of it, that Hill doesn't want to stick around. If he's not going to be a starting quarterback, he wants to go someplace that he can start. And if that's true, that's a bummer, because I think the Saints have enough quality in their program. It would be disappointing to see some sort of added pressure after what we already have going on with that club.
Yeah, well, Taysom Hill obviously better than 99.999% of the population when it comes to playing quarterback. But in the NFL, there are 32 of these starting jobs to go around, and not quite sure he warrants one of those spots. So we'll see what kind of upside the Saints can tap into with Winston this year. Obviously, it could be a lot of living and dying by his antics at times and his risk tolerance. And to quickly circle back on that Giants line for week 1 facing Denver, you guys mentioned now it's in the 2.5 range. I also see in a game like that with a total of 42.5, the consensus right now across the market. And the Giants are in that sweet spot where you could maybe tease them up through a touchdown. And Teddy Bridgewater, yeah, it might be a swing in the Broncos' favor in the market's eyes, but he's also a lower variance option. And when you're teasing an underdog up, lower variance plus a lower total, and the game can work in your favor. So something worth keeping in mind as we inch our way closer to week 1 when the games count. For now, we've got a little bit more time in the preseason, and we're going to use that to our advantage here to provide a comprehensive preview of the NFC North here at BetUS, where the game begins. But before we kick things off, make sure you sign up today at BetUS using the promo code NFL2021 to claim your 125% sign-up bonus exclusive for sports betting, good up to $2,500. To take advantage of the offer and get info on the terms and conditions, check out the link below this video. And while you're at it, you can subscribe to the BetUS YouTube channel, and you know the drill from there. Go ahead and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of the exclusive content we'll be posting. And if you enjoy this video, go ahead and give us a thumbs up. All right, and on that note, I think we're clear to start diving into the NFL North. We'll begin, as we do here, in alphabetical order, and that takes us to the Chicago Bears. We can take a look at some of their odds for the upcoming season, and I think here the focus can be on that regular season win number, 7.5, just a touch of juice to the under. And Scott, when it comes to the Bears this season, the biggest factor, what's going on at quarterback between Andy Dalton and Justin Fields?
Yeah, I think, it's kind of one of those, obviously, Dalton, the veteran, the safer move, of course. Everybody wants to see Justin Fields, though, with all the upside potential. I'm looking at the Bears' schedule. Their bye comes in week 10, so that's pretty late to insert Justin Fields. who we know ultimately is going to be there. It's just a matter of, how long does it take for him to get in there? They start out with the Rams, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, Vegas, then Green Bay. And then it's Green Bay, Tampa, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. My goodness, that's a tough schedule in the middle. They're going to hang on to Dalton until there's a reason not to. And that I think becomes a question of when is that time? Because obviously we know at some point here, Fields is going to be the quarterback. Everyone wants to see him, and that's the long-term plan. They didn't draft him to sit on the bench. I would be shocked if he sat on the bench for a year. This is not Patrick Mahomes. It's not Brett Favre when Rodgers got drafted. So, at some point we're going to see him. It's just a matter of when and how soon.
Yeah, Chris, what do you make of the quarterback situation in Chicago? I think Dalton gets a bad rap. I saw on Colin Cowherd where they were doing these blind comparison tests on stats, and Dalton compares very well with some very notable quarterbacks across the league. I think he's underappreciated, and he was doing okay last year until he had the COVID situation. And when he came back, he had the lingering effects on that. And that wasn't a good situation in there for him in Dallas. So he can get by. And now he's looked horrible this year. But there's no way Fields isn't going to end up in the lineup. Everybody's, in a hurry to get him in there, and they'd rather see him struggle knowing that he's the future. I feel a little bit differently. Well, why do you want to put young quarterbacks in front of bad offensive lines? So that's what really scares me about the Bears. Looking last year, it was really strange how the Bears evolved last year with my math metrics, because there were high aspirations for the Bears last year. A lot of people were were overvaluing them, and my metrics had them really, really bad early in the season. And so I was able to make good money on them last year. I think it went 6-3 on them last year. Yeah, 6-3. So, but then it switched, and it was really funny because they actually, when everybody started to give up on them, they actually subtly got really good, and they ended up finishing, believe it or not. Just a reminder, I did win. I had a good record, so these aren't silly stats. They actually finished higher than the Browns on my final rankings by one spot. So,
hey, but we know you had the Browns like 29th or something, right? I'm kidding.
No. But I couldn't believe it. I mean, because you know what? When the season was over, we went right into the playoffs. I never really dissected how everybody finished at the end of last year. So I had fun with that. And I'm like looking at, and I'm preparing. I go, these guys are never going to believe the Bears have finished higher than the Browns. So that's just a starting point on metrics on how I look each season or each week. So quite the oddity there. Yeah, well, Chris, if you want to go head to head on regular season wins this season, the Bears versus the Browns, I'll give you whatever you want on Chicago. And Scott, maybe we can look at Chicago, some of the underlying metrics, building on what Chris was saying. If we dig into their Pythagorean record last year, their record in close games, that might be a little bit informative as to what we can look out for them moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So they win 8 games last year, which is just very interesting. This means nothing other than I don't think people would really expect this out of Matt Nagy, but he actually has won 8 or more games in every year that he's coached, all 3 years. Kind of surprising. But if we look at that, their Pythagorean theorem last year was 8.1. If we extrapolate that out over 17 games, it's 8.6. So pretty good. A little fortunate in the close games, 6-4. But they do have a very, very tough schedule this year, ranked 9th. And if we look at, the sports books that have set lines in every game this year, we can see Chicago is at an expected win rate of 6.8. And Chris spoke about them last year. They got to a point where they had a pretty easy schedule, and I took advantage of them as well. Trubisky came in and played well, and they took advantage of that. But we can see here the schedule rank being 9th. They're going to face a much more difficult schedule this year than they did last year, Matt.
Yeah, and I think we talked about their quarterback situation, their offense right off the top, but also defensively, they're dealing with some turnover, notably Kyle Fuller departing, reuniting with Vic Fangio in Denver. We might not want to overlook some potential depth concerns for the secondary when it comes to Chicago this year.
Yeah, and you know, I was trying to look back because it seems like they've lost a few players. You know, Amos went to Green Bay a couple years ago, so they kind of slowly but surely started to lose some people on the defensive side. Urban, you know, at defensive tackle, he had a pretty good year for him last year. They lost him. And of course, Charles Leno left at left tackle. So, you know, as Chris said earlier, the offensive line wasn't great last year, and it might even be worse this year as well. So they've also lost some key people there, more so maybe as far as key people on the defensive side, but on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, and Chris, not just offense and defense, but from a coaching standpoint, there's some question marks here too.
Well, you know, touching back on the schedule, though, this is really bizarre. Did anybody notice that they don't have a 2-game homestand or 2-game road stand? They go home away the entire season. So I thought that was kind of odd. But not only are they playing the tougher schedule, like Scott mentioned, they're minus 14 on rest advantage, which is second worst in the league. They really just have some really bad scheduling quirks throughout. But getting back to Nagy, he came over from Kansas City. He's supposed to be this offensive guy, and it just hasn't shown. And it was so bad last year that he actually gave up the play calling, and that's when the team actually got good. So that's when they perked up, and that's when they started to do better. His job is on the line now. So what does he do? He goes back to, he's going to be the play caller again this year. So he's either going to crash and burn and go down with the ship, or somehow he's going to, be able to manage the play calling. So that's going to be interesting to see. They spent their money to get an extra, I think they overspent on a running back, which they didn't need. They've got 3 solid running backs, but they've got the weak offensive line, and they've got a disgruntled wide receiver who's not happy to be there. And the defense has gotten worse each of the last few years, progressively. These guys are aging. Their efficiency isn't there. But, are they going to be able to turn it around against a much tougher schedule? I don't know. I mean, so it just, what I'm looking at there is just how, week after week after week of facing tough teams and, aging players. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just adding on to that, Matt, if we look last year, well, let's go this year, first of all. Chicago's got 10 games against teams projected to win 8.5 or more wins. Only 3 of those games are against teams projected below 7 wins on their 17-game schedule. And that's Detroit twice and Cincinnati. And they've got 7 games projected against teams to win 10-plus games this year. So it gets really, really tough for them. And that's interesting to me because last year they were 7-2 straight up versus losing teams. But 7 of those games were against teams that won less than 6 games. So they had a really, really easy schedule last year. And they were only 1-7 straight up against teams, winning teams last year. So now you add all these very good teams with 10-plus more wins projected, along with some middle of the road teams. I'm leaning under on their season wins here just because of the schedule factor, if nothing else.
I'm leaning under on them also. And here's another team with special teams issues. They only had 51% of their kickoffs go for touchbacks. I mean, that's ridiculous. They only their punt return defense was atrocious, and they had one of the very best kickoff return guys. He's gone this season. So they were already a low-rated special teams unit, and they've lost their best kickoff returner. It's something to look at there.
Yeah, well, I know that both of you guys are leaning under, and while we touched on off the top, there is a lot to look forward to in the future with Justin Fields. He could be a dynamic playmaker and really change things for the Bears, but we're not sure if or when we'll see that this season. So with both of you leaning under on Chicago, before we move on from them, is there anything that could happen between now and week 1 that might nudge you over the edge to actually bet the under?
I don't think so on my side. I mean, obviously if the number went up to 8 or something, but that's, clearly probably not happening. So nothing for me.
I may pull the trigger. I came very close. I've come very close to punching in some futures this past week on a few teams, and I'm like, nah, I'm going to wait. I mean, there's no rush to do it.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I think that's plenty of food for thought as far as the Bears are concerned, and we can move on to our next team in the NFC North. That would be the Detroit Lions. We can take a look at their odds for the 2021 campaign, courtesy of BetUS. And again, I think we can focus here more on the regular season win number. It's only at 5, and it's juiced to the under, minus 125 VIG attached to the Lions under 5. And Chris, we'll tee you up as the resident Lions fan for Detroit this year. It's out with Matt Patricia and Matthew Stafford, in with Dan Campbell and Jared Goff.
Well, everybody's making a big deal about Goff. And now we were happy that Stafford went. We knew that we had to do some sort of a rebuilding. So we were Stafford was so loved. There may be more Lions fans than you could possibly imagine rooting for the Rams this year. So it's sort of like when Verlander left. Okay, we don't. You're not LeBron. We're not unhappy you left. We want success for you. So. As far as we're concerned, Goff is just a bonus because we got 2 first-round draft picks from the Rams coming up and a 3rd-round draft pick. That's not bad. And the fact that we have a quarterback on top of it to go through this bridge gap year, we get draft picks again next year. The next 2 years, we're pretty loaded with draft picks. We can get a quarterback next year. So what's really notable here is how many people are gone. I mean, we don't need to rehash that, but they've lost 11,000 snaps. Think about that. 11,000 snaps are gone. So you're looking at an entirely different team. And there are a couple diamonds in the rough. Everybody likes Dan Campbell. They love Dan Campbell. Okay. He may be ridiculed, for some of the comments that he's made and such, but he's got that team really optimistic. Patricia was such a black cloud, and he wasn't liked, and the defensive schemes that they were trying to run, they couldn't understand it. They were just lost. So it's some things to consider there is there could be a lot of value when spirits are high. And I think the spirits are going to be high for Detroit at least. But what do you say, Scott, about your perspective as an outsider looking at the Lions and their prospects?
Well, I would say this, Chris, for about 10 years, I sat next to a gentleman here in Vegas watching the games every Sunday, and he used to cover the Lions. So he has given me great insight to this organization, and it's just a horrible organization. So I think the first thing I'd have to say is I got to see it. I remember it was 3-4 years ago, and the Lions were doing okay. And he said, Scott, the Lions will not win another game the rest of this year. And there was like 6 or 7 games to go. And I think they lost all but one of them potentially. So, but I do agree with you. It looks like Campbell is potentially a good leader. That's to be determined. But, on the surface, it looks like that. And I also agree that early on, if they like him, that can be some positives. But then when I look at their schedule, San Francisco, Green Bay, and Baltimore out of the gates, that's not an easy schedule to get going. So, look, they're in rebuild mode. Goff is not horrible. It's just like you said, it's just a complete rebuild mode here. And the better the leader is that Campbell is, then, maybe the better we'll see out of the Lions as a whole.
Well, I think it gives them the whole year to just, basically get their feet wet and try a lot of different things. There are some good parts to this team. I mean, if you're in fantasy and you don't have Hawkinson, that's the guy you want. And he's going to get lots and lots and lots of balls thrown at him because they don't have any receivers. In fact, somebody was arguing, and they're probably right, that the Ohio State Buckeyes have a better wide receiving core than the Detroit Lions. So, that's pretty ugly. And they're going to have to do something. I mean, they literally have nobody. Who can name a receiver on the Lions? Nobody. I'll guarantee you 99 out of 100 NFL fans can't name a single receiver for the Lions. And it is that bad. But the offensive line is going to be one of the top 5 offensive lines in the NFL by as early as next year, within the next couple of years, they are pretty darn good. And their actual front seven on defense is pretty good. But the secondary was just non-existent, and they lost some of those guys. So they're gonna give up some points, but they may actually score some points. I worry about DeAndre Swift, though. A lot of people don't realize how good he was last year, and I can't remember the metric I saw, but he was like one of only 2 players to have a certain amount of catches out of the backfield and carries. But there's something up with him. They haven't been playing him. So if you're fantasy, make sure you know that you've looked into that, because there's just something they're not telling us with some nagging concerns. So something to look out for there.
Hey, Chris, I want to ask you about the offensive line. They allowed 2.63 sacks per game last year, so they were very bad, of course. First of all, to say they're going to improve, I start to question that. But on the other side, I'm looking at their starters. Taylor Decker, not bad at left tackle. Obviously, the rookie, we don't know what's going to happen at right tackle with Sewell. And Ragnow is, I think, a pretty dang good center. So I'm just kind of interested in why. Is it because of like maybe those 3 names I mentioned off that you rattled off that you think their offensive line is going to be drastically better?
Well, yeah, Ragnow is considered by some as the best center in the NFL, and yep. Sewell was, he's the big stud, and the other guys are, I don't follow the offensive line closely. But everywhere I hear, they say this is going to be great. Even peripheral guys that ridicule the Lions, always throw in that add on. Oh, that offensive line is going to be good. So I'm parroting somewhat, so to speak, when it comes to that. And the other bright spot is their special teams. They were number 3 in the NFL in special teams. They've got a great punter, but their kicking game this year, oh boy, they got rid of Prater. Prater only made 75% of his field goals last year, so something had to give. But they've got 2 kickers that are not good. They're having problems making 40, kicks in the 40s. So we're used to having kickers that are making, kicks in the 50s. So without that, that's going to change the scoring for them.
Well, and I'll just say this too. I mean, you talked about their secondary. Last year, they only got 1.5 sacks per game, which just tells me that they're getting no pressure up front as well. So, I mean, those are the things that I'm looking for this year. Is anything drastically changing from this team in some of those regards? Like you said, the secondary's not good. No pressure up front. Offensive line allowing a lot of sacks. Now, maybe that's scheme related. We'll find out. But those are some of the things that I would be looking at for them to see if we're going to get any improvement on this team at all.
Well, they did, their Kuda was out. There was their top stud secondary receiver, cornerback from Ohio State. And cornerback's by far the hardest position to transition to the NFL with. So you've got to cut him a little bit of slack. And I heard a podcast with him where he was really, really mature. He knows what he screwed up. He just didn't have the right perspective. He worked out too much, and by the time the season came, he didn't understand the rigors of the long season. So those are things that he's going to be changing this year. He has got a great attitude. I do worry, though, that some of the beat writers are saying he's still a step slow. So that scares me just a little bit, but he's got the right attitude.
Chris, was that podcast by any chance The Daily Stoic?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what other NFL shows will mention a podcast called The Daily Stoic when breaking down teams, but that was a really impressive interview. It was good to get a glimpse at Okudah beyond the X's and O's and just into his personality. And regardless of what he will or won't do on the field, it made him, I think, a lot easier to root for. So yeah, I listened to that as well, and I had some similar takeaways. And I think we have an interesting juxtaposition here with what we've talked about so far with Detroit, because on one hand, a lot of rebuilding going on. Chris, you mentioned their draft prospects for the future. It looks like they could be reloading in a pretty decent way in the coming years. And at the same time, with a guy like Dan Campbell, I feel like previous coaches of his level of intensity, it seems like the kind of thing that gets a lot of buy-in pretty quickly. But if it doesn't go well, and sometimes even if it does, look at Jim Harbaugh in San Francisco, it can wear thin. So I almost wonder if we might see paths cross where the rebuild starts to bulk up the roster, And, Dan Campbell might wear out his welcome if he keeps things at such a, intense level. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's not just Dan Campbell. I saw a quote yesterday. I'd never heard of this guy, Aubrey Pleasant. I had to actually look him up, and he's a defensive back coach or something like that. And players were making a comment that they love this guy. He brings a huge intensity to him, and just a great motivator. So, Dan Campbell's putting, coaches on the team that are like that.
Yeah, it'll be, I think my biggest thing to watch is probably going to be what happens, again, quarterback just being as important as it is. Jared Goff going from Sean McVay to a combination of Dan Campbell and Anthony Lynn. Even this preseason, I mean, as a Chargers fan, this sounds familiar to me. Lynn seemingly still too run heavy on first down, struggling to manage the clock. Goff seems like he's serviceable if everything is set up right for him. I'm especially doubtful that we're going to see much of it this year. But again, long-term prospects for the Lions might be looking up. But in 2021, Chris, I'm glad you said they have a good punter, because they might need to put him to some pretty hefty use.
Well, I did forget to mention one of the worst comments I saw is the writers are referring to Goff as timid. So, and we know that McVay was primary play caller for him, and if he wasn't being told the plays, he was a little bit lost. So we don't have high expectations for our timid guy. So we don't have any expectations. You can't bet this team over, that's for sure. The only direction to look is under. I mean, they really could their schedule is so difficult. It's one of the top 5 worst schedules. I think it was like number 2 or number 3. They're not going anywhere. So the only way you can look on this is under and have no expectations, just observe.
Yeah, well, Scott, we've gotten some really good insight from Chris as a Lions fan, also obviously with his sharp betting acumen. But in terms of those expectations, what do you numbers say we can look for from them in 2021 based on maybe some numbers last year that might have skewed their results one way or the other?
Yeah, if we look at the Pythagorean theorem numbers on this one, Matt, they win 5 games last year. That translated to about 5.1 in the Pythagorean theorem number. We extrapolate that out over 17 games. That was really about 5.4, pretty close to where their number is set this year as well. So, and I think in lucky win or close games, they were just looking here 4-4. So nothing, shocking there. But again, as Chris said, I've got them rated as the 6th toughest schedule. 10 games against teams projected to win 8.5 games or more, and that's pretty tough. So we can see there, just looking 5.1, as I mentioned, that extrapolates out to 5.4. Very close in the close games, 4-4 at 500. And if you look at all their lines for this year, we can see that translates to 4.7. And I think we saw the over-under number was 5. Shaded about 25 cents to the under, which is right about where the 4.7 lines up. So to me, it's a neutral play for me with the Lions. It's very hard to go under 5 wins in my mind, but you certainly can't play them over. And like I said, I'm just looking at the schedule. San Francisco, Green Bay, Baltimore, just out of the gates. There's Cleveland in there, Green Bay again, Seattle. It's not an easy schedule.
And I try not to. I like the Lions too much, so I feel like I'm slanted, and I just kind of try not to bet on anything that's not model related. But as a fan, I look at this, and I don't know where they get the wins. Where are they going to get even 3 wins? I don't. They look like a 2-win team to me, and I'm saying that as a Lions fan. But maybe I'm just too close. I don't know. But I kind of just try to stay away from any arbitrary decisions on betting with my home teams.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And a wise man once told me, Chris, that we get surprised every year. So we don't need to be surprised when the teams we think are going to be bad turn out to be good, and vice versa. But something I think I might revisit when we talk about Houston next week, when we get those surprises every year. Even bad teams win sometimes, and the Lions might still be bad like we think they will be. And this number is so low. So I think, like Scott said, a lot of it is ultimately baked into the price at this stage.
Yeah.
All right. On that note, I think we've covered some ground on Detroit and Chicago. Some better teams coming up, the first of which would be the favorite in the division, the Green Bay Packers. We can take a look at their numbers for the season, and this is the first Super Bowl contender we're touching on today, so we might as well mention that number as well. 12-1 at BetUS, the current offering for the Packers to win the Super Bowl, 6-1 to win the NFC, -175, so a fairly heavy favorite to win the division, and the regular season win total number reflects that as well, 10.5 juiced to the over. And Scott, we know that Aaron Rodgers and the skill positions are outstanding in Green Bay, but the offensive line might end up being the X factor for those Super Bowl aspirations.
Yeah, I think it's a big question mark. I don't know, and I'd be interested to hear from you guys if you've heard anything as far as when Bakhtiari is going to come back, the left tackle. He might be the best left tackle in the league. He got hurt, I think it was in the Rams game in the playoffs last year. That's huge, obviously. And then Corey Linsley, their center, he is now with the Chargers, so they draft Josh Myers, a center out of Ohio State, which ironically that's where Linsley came from as well. So we'll see, how that position plays out at center. And right tackle, we're going to see. I mean, that thing, Brian Bulaga was there a few years ago. He left before last year. They had, some other people there last year that aren't here this year. So this offensive line is very questionable to me. Now, as I've said in previous shows, a good quarterback, a good system can overcome a bad offensive line. And the Packers, they haven't always had great offensive lines on their team in the past. So Rodgers can probably camouflage a lot of that, but that will be one of the main things that I'm paying attention to as the season gets going.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see the impact that the offensive line question marks could have on Rodgers. Of course, we're just guessing now. The offensive line might be all right. Bakhtiari might return to form. Right off the bat. So we'll see. But with those excellent skill positions, I mean, Devontae Adams and Aaron Jones, it doesn't get much better than that for elite receivers and running backs to surround Aaron Rodgers with. But if protection's an issue, Rodgers has a track record of throwing the ball away incredibly often when the offensive line is problematic. And another aspect of the Packers offense I'm really curious about this season, kind of flipping the coin on a previous element we've discussed on this show with other teams, where if they can just be below average in certain areas, that would represent an improvement. I think of Washington's quarterback situation or the Chargers special teams. If they can just be 24th in the league, that might set them up for success given the strengths elsewhere on those rosters. On the flip side for Green Bay, Aaron Rodgers could still be elite this season, but it's almost certainly going to be a downgrade no matter what, coming off a historic 2020. So they're going to need to make up that ground in some other areas.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
48 touchdowns and only 5 interceptions. He went halfway through the season without an interception, if I remember correctly. So 71% completions. How can you repeat that? So we already know that there's going to be regression. You're not going to be able to match that. The other thing, their field goal kicking, 16 out of 16, perfect right there. Their third down conversion rate was 49%. Are they going to be able to do that again this year? I don't know. For me, I don't know what it is, but I kind of had Green Bay off in this little, category where, they're just going to be Green Bay. They're going to be good. You don't even want to actually do a deep dive on them because you feel like you already know, what they are and what they're going to be. And it's going to be a little bit interesting this year because their schedule is harder this year than it was last year. And they finished the season with 4 out of 5 games on the road. So it's going to be tricky. They were up there in the rankings for me last year at number 6, the third best offense, but their defense was okay at 13th. But now the competition is going to get tough.
Well, and I'll just say, first of all, I follow the Packers kind of like you follow the Lions, Chris. And I've said this always, and this goes back to 1996 when they, won that Super Bowl with Favre, and then of course in 2010 with Rodgers. As far as this defense goes, is as far as this team will go. In 96, they gave up the fewest points in the league. And in 2010, they gave up like 15 points a game, were remarkable on the turnover thing. And remember, with Rodgers 2 years ago, they win 13 games, but they were about average from the line of scrimmage. They were not really above average at all. And then obviously last year, they were fantastic, and they win 13 games as well. So they've done it both ways, but a lot of that, like you said, they've had fairly easy schedules. Now, it's a little hard because you can say, well, they played the Bears, who were 500. Well, you know what? They beat the Bears twice. So they add to make these teams look average because they're beating these teams. So it impacts the other team's records. But they really have had fairly easy schedules. And this year, it appears that it'll be a little bit tougher schedule. And, you know, we'll see how they react to that because it doesn't look like it's going to be quite as easy as some previous years.
Yeah, I actually have a note here that says that they have the largest schedule shift from easy to hard. So they had the widest swing out of all 32 teams. So one other side note, I was reading through my buddy's draft notes. He says Amari Rodgers is going to be a real key for their third round pick. He could be a real key for that offense. So keep your eyes out on him.
Scott, I know that we talked in some earlier previews about the Packers being the poster child for regression last year. That didn't really happen from a Pythagorean standpoint. If you took the under on Green Bay, it doesn't matter how good of a number you got. It seemingly never had a chance. When we look at their Pythagorean numbers from 2020, how does that inform your approach to them for 2021?
Yeah, so they win 13 games last year. Their Pythagorean number was 10.9. We extrapolate that out over 17 games. That's 11.6. So they overachieved. But, you know, they were only 3-2 in close games. So it's not like they got super lucky in those games. But they certainly did overachieve. And if we look, you know, from a schedule standpoint, kind of the middle of the road, we're seeing 19th there. And looking at their projected lines, they would win about 10.7 games. The two other points that I just looked at, LaFleur's been there for 2 years. They are 11-1 straight up within the division in the 2 years that LaFleur's been there. So they are dominating the division, whatever that might mean. For we know they're obviously heavily favorites to win this division. But the other thing I looked at is they're 7-6 straight up versus winning teams, and 21-2 straight up versus 500 or losing teams. And Chris hit on this earlier, just a few minutes ago. They got 10 games against teams projected to win 8.5 games or more. And obviously that could look much different by the end of the season. But, you know, they're about 500 against really good teams, and they dominate the bad teams. But they're, in theory, potentially going to see more of the good teams this year. And so when I started kind of working all those numbers, it got me right back to about 10.5, which is kind of where this number was. Because originally I was thinking, like, if they win a division, how can they not go 11-6 at least? But, you know, when you start to factor in a little bit tougher schedule, the number seems to be about right for me.
They face the top 5 schedule of defenses, both against the pass and against the run. So we're going to see how good their offense is pretty fast.
Yeah, and Chris, to your earlier point, and I think, Scott, you brought it up too, that could put some extra pressure on the defense if the offense, again, the true talent could be just as good as it was last year, but the results might show a bit of regression. On the defensive side, they have a new defensive coordinator, Joe Barry. He comes over under the Brandon Staley coaching tree with the Rams. Obviously, a big calling card there was deception. And yeah, you don't have a talent like Aaron Donald's up front for the Packers, but there are some pretty good players there. Do you expect the Packers defense, Scott, to maybe keep opponents on their heels more than in previous years under the Joe Barry regime for their defense?
Yeah, I think they've got some potential. You know, I'm just pulling them up here too. So, and don't forget, Jaire Alexander, one of the cornerbacks, one of the best cornerbacks in the league. Just looking here, you know, last year he was fantastic. Kevin King had that debacle, of course, in the playoffs, but they also drafted Eric Stokes with their first draft pick, so another cornerback. So if he can materialize and he ends up being very good, along with Alexander, they've got pretty good safeties. They have the chance to, you know, get some pressure on the quarterback. If they can do all that, yeah, I think this defense could be very good for them, and that's really what they need. They need this defense to get to the next level, in my opinion, and then, you know, they could run through this league potentially. And it sounds funny saying that for a team who's gone to the NFC Championship game so often in the last, you know, whatever it is, 5, 6, 7 years. But, you know, last year I thought they actually finally had a chance, but obviously Tampa Bay had other ideas there. But they just need that defense to step up. They do have some pieces there. If Stokes is the right draft pick, I think this defense could even get better.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, I think there's a lot to like about the Packers. Still some question marks that we'll want to watch early in the season, but we can see why they're a favorite to repeat as NFC North champs. But the challenger that might give them the best run for their money would be the fourth and final team we're going to touch on today, the Minnesota Vikings. So let's take a look at their odds at BetUS for the 2021 season to challenge the Packers in the NFC North potentially. The Vikings are a plus 225 underdog. Regular season wins a flat 9. And Chris, when we look at the Vikings, as much as offense is the name of the game in the NFL in 2021, it's their defense that may ultimately determine their fate in the NFC.
Yeah, you're going to see big changes this year. One comment I'd like to make, as I noticed it looking at the Minnesota schedule today, is all 4 of these teams are favored in fewer number of games than their win total. So none of these teams are favored in more games than their win total. So just a reminder to everybody to always try to gravitate and look for unders, because you're always going to lose. You're going to lose value trying to bet overs, because too many people like to bet overs. So there's like a little built-in juice in betting overs in general. It's especially true with player props and totals, all that kind. But people forget the Vikings have a good foundation for a great defense. Everybody knows about their offense, but Zimmer was quoted. He said, "This is the worst defense I've ever seen." So they finished number 32 in my metrics, number 11 offensively. I think some might have thought it might have been higher, but you got to remember Thielen was out, Cook was out. This team is scary offensively. I mean, they really are scary. And they're going to be playing an easier schedule this year. They're going to get a lot of people back on defense. If they can just get adequate, people underrate Cousins. Cousins had a monster year last year. He's 35 touchdowns, only 13 picks, completed 68% of his passes. Another unique stat that I heard this morning is he has the exact same success ratio, whether he's under pressure or whether he's in the pocket, and that's very odd, because usually the quarterbacks have much different stats based on their comfort level. And he's just a steady Eddie type of guy. And obviously with what's going on with COVID and stuff, maybe he's getting more flack than normal. So that's my initial look at Minnesota. What do you think, Scott?
Well, I agree with you. I was really shocked last year, Zimmer being such a defensive guy. They've always had great defensive players and great defensive teams. And, they basically let everybody go almost in the secondary. And that secondary was just a mess. And then you add in, Daniel Hunter gets hurt, Anthony Barr gets hurt, Eric Kendricks gets hurt. And, to your point, Chris, they're bringing back Hunter. He's probably the most valuable out of all of them. Barr and Kendricks have been good. Barr's kind of regressed a little bit in the last few years, but Hunter will be a big, guy coming back for them. The offense, like you said, it's lights out. Justin Jefferson, if he duplicates what he did last year, this offense is going to be very good. And then it really comes down to the secondary. I know they bring over Patrick Peterson, I believe. Peterson, I think, is okay. I don't think he's fantastic anymore, but if that secondary can improve, then I think that defense has a chance to get back to something similar that we've seen with a Mike Zimmer defense in the past. Because last year that was not a Mike Zimmer defense at all.
No, yeah. But the oldest cornerback was 23 years old last year. So right. And as I mentioned earlier, that's the hardest position to learn. So they've got a year under their belt. They've got returning players that were either injured or opt-outs. This defense is going to be expected to be, a top 10 to top 15 defense, and that's a huge difference from number 32 last year.
Yeah, and Chris, you mentioned cornerback maybe being the hardest position to learn. It also might be the hardest scheme to learn the hardest position, because Zimmer's famous for having a really tough scheme to pick up on. So with a lot of these young guys, it's not just the general development, but developing in this system specifically. We could see the Vikings secondary primed for a lot of, even bigger year 2 leaps than we would typically see. And Scott, to your point about the facelift for the front seven, I'd like to underscore that, because they, in addition to guys like Hunter and Kendricks and Barr, some names, these aren't household names, but I'll mention them because I think small upgrades across the board can amount to a big upgrade overall. So they're also adding guys like Dalvin Tomlinson, Michael Pierce, Everson Griffin back in the fold in Minnesota. And something I came across from Payne Insider that I found really interesting, he mentioned that last year, the Vikings had the lowest pressure rate of any team in the league since 2012. And if we look at a guy like Hunter, across the NFL in 2018 and 2019 combined, he had the most quarterback pressures. So we could see a lot of maturation in the secondary, and just a huge facelift could make it, night and day up front for the Vikings this year as well.
To your point, Matt, 48 sacks in 2018, 23 sacks last year in 2019. And that was a huge difference for him. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Pierce was a COVID casualty last year where he sat out. So that's just another body that wasn't there at all last year, if I'm right on that.
Here's another team where you got to look at special teams again. They were number 31st in the league in special teams. How does this Dan Bailey get a job? He was 15 for 22. I remember when he was at Dallas before, and I just laughed that he got a job after leaving Dallas, because I don't know how they have him in the league still. So that's something that they have to definitely improve on. Well, there's nowhere to go but up. And another key, number one home field advantage in the league, right side by side with Seattle. They had no fans last year, so they had a big drop off. They have fans this year, and they matter in Minnesota.
Yeah, Chris, what do you make of that? Because I know for a couple years before, we didn't have fans in the stands for a lot of last season. Home field advantage was said to be on the decline, but there are still teams like the Vikings that have, a real big difference with their home crowd. Do you bump them right back up to their priors before 2020, or do you move it somewhere in the middle, but maybe give them a notch or two up compared to most other teams?
Oh, I think the team is extremely optimistic. I think the fans are very optimistic. I think they're going to be there. There's going to be a big push. Honestly, I wanted to kind of be anti-Vikings when I looked into this team, because there's just too many people there are a lot of people that think the Vikings won't be good, but it seems like there's more people that think the Vikings are going to be really good. And for whatever reason, I wanted to get predisposition to be against the Vikings. And it's really hard to be against the Vikings. They're playing a much easier schedule this year. And they've got the fans. That defense is going to be a hell of a lot better. If they can to me, when I was betting against Minnesota, watching Cook and Thielen and Cousins and Jefferson, it just scared the crap out of me. So they have a hell of a lot more than the vast majority of these teams have as far as the notable players. It's a matter of the nuts and the bolts. And one of the problems is, they've had 38 draft picks in the last 3 years. Why are they only just a playoff contender? Their last draft, they're going to be lucky if one of these guys makes the starting lineup this year. And if you look back for the last 11 years, they've got 114 draft picks, and they're not. What do you do with that many draft picks every year that you can't be a playoff team? So there's something wrong with the players they're bringing in too.
Yeah, well, Scott, when it comes to their prospects of being a playoff team, Chris also touched on the schedule this year. Walk us through what you see with their schedule and some of the underlying metrics that might shape our opinion on how likely they are to become a playoff team and maybe make a deep run in the playoffs this coming season.
Yeah, so if we look at their Pythagorean numbers as well, Matt, so last year the Vikings win 7 games. That translated to about 7.1 wins. And then if we extrapolate that again over 17 games, that's 7.5 wins. So that's below the 9 wins that we've set the over-under mark at. However, obviously, as we spoke, they're going to get some defensive guys back. They're 5-4 in close games, nothing special there. Chris kind of alluded to it, the schedule, 22nd, pretty pedestrian there. And if we look at all the lines projected for them over the 17 weeks of this season, translates to 9.2, which gets us right where their over-under number is. The thing that I will look for, so it's a bad offensive line. I don't know that it's getting tremendously better. They did draft the tackle from Virginia Tech in the first round, so maybe that adds and helps that. And so, we'll see what happens there. The secondary's got to improve. They get some of those guys back. The other key factor for me is Kirk Cousins, and this is not all on Kirk Cousins, but he's been there for 3 years now. And when he has played teams that won 10 or more games in a league, he has gone 0-6, 1-5, and 1-6 straight up. That is 2-17 straight up in games against teams that won 10 or more games which is very good teams. And they're 24-6 straight up against all other teams. So they take care of business other than against the elite teams. But as Chris said, thankfully, I think they only play 6 games against teams that are projected to win 10+ games this year. So it's a relatively easier schedule. And if they can make any improvement on the defensive side of the ball as well, then they have a legitimate chance to be very good here. They went into Green Bay. Green Bay's one loss under Matt LaFleur within the division was to the Vikings last year. A little bit of a win game that maybe derailed the Packers offense a little bit. But, for the most part, they can challenge Green Bay. They can definitely challenge Green Bay if they can improve that defense and get it back to some sort of standards that we've seen in the past with the Vikings.
And they're going to control their own destiny. They're backloaded with a difficult schedule at the back. So don't get overconfident that this is a monster team if they start off with a really good start, because they finished 4 out of their last 6 games against the division. They play Pittsburgh and the Rams and San Francisco. Or they play Pittsburgh and the Rams on that in the final 6. And then if you go back 8 games, they've got Green Bay and San Francisco. So it finishes rough for them.
Yeah, I think with the NFC. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, it's a good point, Chris. I mean, things that I'm looking at their schedule here. So Cincinnati, Arizona, Seattle, Cleveland. Obviously, those 2 teams pretty good. Detroit, California, Carolina.
They get them at home. Remember.
Yeah, but let's just say their defense isn't that good. You may not see that exposed on this first part of the schedule, and you might have some opportunities to play against them, obviously, just because they're not facing great offensive juggernauts, Cincinnati, Detroit, Carolina. So those are just things to kind of look for within the schedule. Are there things that are just being, kind of covered up because of the level of the schedule that maybe you can take advantage of later in the season?
Yeah.
Yeah, as you guys walk through a lot of what's coming Minnesota's way later in the season, I'm reminded of the NFC East preview we did and touching on a lot of head-to-head matchups in that division. That's one that will probably hinge the most on, some late season matchups in terms of who's going to win the NFC East. In the NFC North, it could be a pretty similar dynamic, and we can take a look at the outright odds to win the division because, once again, the Packers, a heavy favorite to go ahead and repeat, but we talked about a few reasons why the Vikings might give them a run for their money. So to level set here, the Packers, again, -175, the Vikings +225, and then the Bears +500. Detroit, obviously, a little ways back at 22-1. So overall in the NFC North, it might be a 2-horse race, but, stranger things have happened. So we'll see what happens. It might take a lot of the late season matchups to really shape the ultimate outcome here. And I think we can get into a few leans to close out the show. I don't think any of us have any bets at the moment in this division. I'll go ahead and kick it off just because it's the team we've been talking about for the last few minutes, the Minnesota Vikings. I do lean over 9 for them. I really think we're going to see a big improvement from the defense. I love the skill positions on the offense. Home field advantage, Chris, you touched on it. Getting that back could be much bigger for Minnesota than most other teams. But in terms of why it's just a lean, Scott, you touched on some offensive line concerns. I mean, Christian Darrisaw, their first-round left tackle pick, already had to have a surprise second surgery for a core muscle injury. That kind of blindsided Mike Zimmer from the looks of it. And we know that Kirk Cousins can do a lot when things are set up well for him, but he's not the best creator under havoc. So a little bit of trepidation about the Vikings up front on offense. And really, it all boils down to the price. As bullish as I feel about Minnesota, I think at the current number, it's safe to say the market's caught up. It had been lower earlier in the offseason, but at a flat 9, just a lean to the over for me on Minnesota. I know you guys had under leans on Chicago. So Chris and Scott, any final thoughts just to tie a bow around why you lean that way with the Bears?
I think, I'm starting to like Minnesota more, and I'm starting to see why the wheels could come off the bus in Green Bay. I think the Green Bay fans are sick and tired of Rodgers shtick, and I'm sick of it. I think everybody's sick of it. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong with Green Bay. And, there might be a domino effect that, Minnesota can take advantage of within the division. So I would kind of lean over. I'm considering a wager on the Bears under, but if the wheels come off the bus with Green Bay, well, there's there's not a lot of room for error on that under. The Lions, I said I could only go under, but I'm going to leave that alone because it's my home team. And That's my outlook. I certainly wouldn't be going over on Green Bay. That's for sure.
Yeah, and my lean on the under in Chicago is just simply this team did not perform well against really good teams, and they're going to play a lot more good teams this year than they did last year. That's really it right there. I mean, they're just going to play a much tougher schedule, and so I see a little bit of value there, not enough to make it a bet, but I'll lean under their season wins.
Got it. Sounds good. Well, Chris and Scott, as always, appreciate your insight here. And I'd like to thank the audience as we start to wrap this up for tuning in to the BetUS NFL show. If you're watching this or listening to it in podcast form and you have any thoughts, questions, or topics for future videos, feel free to let us know. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment in the video. If you're listening in podcast form, you can reach out to us on Twitter. You can follow Chris on Twitter at LasVegasCris. That's CRIS. Scott is at Sixth Sense NFL. I'm at MLandis18. And for those of you watching on YouTube, you know the drill. Please go ahead and subscribe to the BetUS YouTube channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of the action. And if you like what we're doing, and again, I always like to say, if you've made it this far, you probably do. Please take a quick moment to give this video a thumbs up. That really helps us out. And last but not least, don't forget to use the promo code NFL2021 when signing up at BetUS to claim your 125% sign-up bonus, exclusive for sports betting, good up to $2,500. All right, and as we sign off, a friendly reminder, we are here with you every Tuesday and Friday throughout the season. So next up, it's going to be the AFC South on Tuesday. We'll see you then right back here at BetUS, where the game begins.